Story of War. Een interview met Pieter Maass, een Amerikaanse journalist die de oorlog in Bosnië van nabij meemaakte en een boek schreef. Love Thy Neighbor, A Story of War. We praten met hem in Amsterdam. War has raged in Central Europe. And Pieter Maass is the author of a book called The Story of War, and which is basically your experiences as a war correspondent in the Bosnian, Serbian, ex-Yugoslavian area in the past years.
Right. In 1992-93, I was covering the war in Bosnia for the Washington Post, and spent most of my time in Bosnia, but also was in Serbia and also in Croatia as well. And so the book itself is basically kind of a chronicle or a memoir, I suppose, of my own journey through this war from the beginning when I first went to Bosnia and actually never been there before. And just as I went through, as I learned what was going on, as I reported what was going on, what I learned and how I suppose it affected the people around me and to a certain extent myself.
Yes, because that's what I sense from. It's not only a story of war, but the other half of the title is Love Thy Neighbor. Which seems like you didn't like it.
Well, I mean, I found it quite, fascinating to be there. The main title, "Love Thy Neighbor," I used that because it's a very ironic use of that phrase, of course, "Love Thy Neighbor," because this was the exact opposite of what people were actually doing there. And so what I tried to get at in this book, because this is the question that interested me the most, is how it was that people who had lived together as neighbors for so long could come to fight each other as they did, and do it, as violently, as brutally as it happened in Bosnia. And whenever I talked to people outside of the region, they always would ask me, how could this kind of thing happen? How could neighbors fight each other like this? And so that was kind of the question I tried to explore in the book. How could neighbors do that?
Did you find an answer?
Well, I found, an answer. I don't know if it's the only one. There probably are many. But the answer that I found was that unfortunately it's easier than we think for people to be manipulated, to hate their neighbor, even though they've lived next door to each other for quite a long time, a Serb and a Croat and a Muslim, and even though they lived together peacefully, never had troubles. Nonetheless, by virtue of propaganda, the Serb listening to Serbian radio or watching Serbian television, which tells him that the Muslims are going to mount a war and commit genocide against the Serbs, that Serb can be manipulated into joining an attack against those Muslims.
You're implying that the manipulation by, say, modern media played a major role in the whole development of the conflict.
It's been said that history is very important in this conflict, but actually television is more important than history. Without the use of television, which was the main propaganda outlet for Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, and Franjo Tudjman, the president of Croatia, which are the two main actors in this war against Bosnia. Without the use of television, without their direct use of it as a way to motivate their people to transfer these ideas that the Muslims were going to attack them. Without that, without the ability to demonize the Bosnians, the Muslims, without the use of television, it would not have happened, because there was not any natural groundswell of support for this kind of a war.
This demonizing worked, in fact, for all three parties involved. Everybody demonized everybody else, or not?
Well, no, not really, because there was not equality, okay? Because there were, in the end, three sides. The Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosnians, most of whom were Muslim. But the Bosnians basically, in my view, and I think in the view of an increasing majority of people, were the innocent victims, because they did not provoke an attack, they did not arm themselves beforehand, they did not pose a threat to anybody. But the Serbs and the Croats, for territorial reasons, because they wanted parts of Bosnia, quite large parts of Bosnia, they were the ones who used this propaganda amongst their own population to get them motivated, to get them involved in war, to polarize people within Bosnia so that even the people living in Bosnia who had lived together peacefully would fight.
And they fought their neighbors violently. They drove them out. We have seen whole campaigns of driving people out, and there's been severe cruelty, genocides. You speak in your book about genocide?
Well, it's an attempted genocide. I mean, fortunately, it was not a successful genocide. I mean, you cannot, compare it directly, for example, to the Holocaust in World War II. And it's somewhat of, to me, a side issue and distracts from the main question. I mean, you should not have to have every person of a certain nationality or religion wiped out before you can call it a genocide. In this case, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 people were killed, and there are several million Bosnians, several million Muslims. So the complete population was not wiped out, although that would have happened were they not able to resist and had there not been some intervention at the end. But I would call it an attempted genocide.
This intervention at the end is what keeps the minds of the Dutch citizens a little bit busy, because Holland was involved in the Srebrenica enclave, where seemingly horrible things happened. Have you had any direct contact with that area?
Well, I was unable, as most journalists were at the time, to get anywhere near Srebrenica because it was surrounded by Serbs and nobody was allowed in, and basically no food, very little medicine was allowed in. It was under the worst siege one could imagine. I mean, compared to Srebrenica, Sarajevo was an open city. So I was not able to get in there. Nobody was able to get in there until afterwards, basically. So my familiarity with it basically was limited to radio conversations when I was in Sarajevo that I was able to have with people in Srebrenica over military radio to ask them what the conditions were. And of course, these were quite frightening conditions that they were under. And I remember when I was in Sarajevo and there were several attacks going on against not just Srebrenica but other enclaves, including Žepa and a town called Konjevic Polje.
Did you get from those discussions, did you get the feeling that they would be driven out, mass murdered, whatever you call it, but that there would be, a panic as happened, that the Serbs in fact not only drove them out and forced them out, but killed large numbers of people?
Well, yes, because this had been going on for many months in Bosnia. So everybody knew that, what tactics were used by the Serbs when they attacked and when they conquered territories. They either cleansed the territories or they killed the people who were there, usually the men. They usually would let the women and children leave. And in this case, everybody kind of knew what would come if the Serbs were able militarily to move forward. So
the people knew what was happening, but did the commanders and did the military Western forces, did they know?
I think they knew what was going to happen. I mean, they had certainly, very adequate intelligence. They knew what had happened beforehand in terms of the Serb tactics, the Serb goals. I think they knew that if the Serbs chose to attack, and they probably would, that the United Nations forces that were in place could not resist because they didn't have enough numbers, they didn't have enough weapons. And I think it was inevitable, probably, that things would happen as they did, particularly once it became clear that the Western forces were not willing to use air power to stop the Serbs. That was virtually, in my mind, a green light and made it virtually inevitable that the Serbs would indeed attack these safe areas and take control of them.
Now, this is all based on the fact that the uniformed forces were not going to act. Now, you spoke several times with the major generals and military people around it. Did you have a feeling that they knew that the places would not be defended?
Well, they often complained quite openly that they did not have enough men and enough weapons to fulfill the mandate they had. I mean, because they had a mandate from the United Nations to protect these safe areas. And they quite openly said, if you want us to do this, we need more men, we need more weapons. And they did not get it. And so as a result of that, what they then said, also quite openly, was that since we don't have the men, since we don't have the weapons, we have to bargain with the Serbs. We can't fight them because we don't have enough power here in place to do that. And so as a result of that, they were relatively open in terms of explaining their weaknesses and in terms of explaining the weakness of their bargaining position. Mm-hmm. But this was something that was not so much their fault, but the fault of the politicians who decided how many men they would send there, what weapons would be sent there, and whether or not the order would be given, for example, for airstrikes against the Serbs, or whether the order would be given for the arms embargo against the Bosnian government to be lifted.
Mm-hmm. All in all, it became a rather messy situation. It's now more or less cleared, but do you think the underlying conflict is still there, or what do you think is going to happen over the...
Well, without a doubt, the underlying conflict is still there. The underlying conflict now is that you have several million refugees, Bosnians, who cannot return home, who cannot return to the homes they had in Banja Luka, in Visegrad, or Tomislavgrad, an area under Croat control. And because they can't return home, That is the problem. Until they can return home, there won't be stability. And if they can't return home peacefully, which the Dayton Accord says they should be able to do but is not happening, if they can't do that peacefully, then probably sooner or later there's going to be another war to settle that question.
It's the same situation as in Israel, where you have a West Bank that is still... So the next war is built in?
In a way, and one of the differences, there are many differences, of course, between Bosnia and the Middle East, but one of the differences actually, which in a way makes the next war perhaps more probable, is that whereas the Palestinians did not have their own army or their own weapon, the Bosnian government does, and there's been a great injustice inflicted against them. There continues to be a great injustice in that their own people can't return home. And therefore, one way or the other, somewhere down the line, I imagine they are going to want to settle accounts and get justice. If it can be done peacefully, great. But if it can't be, perhaps militarily, which would be very unfortunate because the next war will be, as bad as the one that we just saw.
I have the feeling that what the West has done there is just barely scratch the surface, send some troops in, but then as soon as the West said, these are war criminals, it's like a laughing stock of the world. I mean, people were condemned or whatever at these various tribunals, but nothing happened. They just remained what they were before.
Well, to my mind, it's absolutely shameful because you have in Bosnia the worst war criminals, accused war criminals that Europe has seen since World War II. And you also have in Bosnia nearly 50,000 international troops, most of them from NATO countries. The idea that they're rubbing elbows and passing by each other all the time and that our troops are not doing anything about it, to me is a moral calamity. And it's also, to my mind, a political calamity, because if you want to solve the problem and not have another war, then arresting the war criminals actually will help you quite a bit, because it removes from Bosnia the people who have been causing so much trouble, who are the purveyors of this hatred. And it also makes a message quite clearly to anybody else who thinks that they might try to do the same sorts of things in the future, that they too will end up being arrested and taken to an international court of justice.
You've spoken with these people. Where do they come from? When we talk about the leaders, where did their hatred, anger, frustration versus the other parties came from? Is this a historical thing? Is it a racial thing? Mm-hmm. Is it poverty turned into aggression?
Well, there are, of course, different reasons that different people got involved in these kinds of things, but the most important ones to look at are the political leaders at the very top who set this whole process in motion. And this would be people like President Milosevic of Serbia. This would be people like Radovan Karadzic, who's the Bosnian Serb leader. People like, to a different extent, Franjo Tudjman in Croatia. And in particular with Milosevic, the president of Serbia, and Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader. It has nothing to do with ideology. It really has nothing to do in a way with nationalism. It has to do with political opportunism. Milosevic was, in 1986, an unknown functionary in the Communist Party in Serbia. He realized that, as anybody did, that communism was in trouble, and the way to stay in power, to get power, was to use nationalism. And so he used it. He became a nationalist, and it was successful. He got power. In order to stay in power, he had to pursue this nationalist course. And then when it became clear, once the war in Bosnia was grinding on and Serbia was...
So what you're really implying is that it's not the ideology. No. It is the opportunism of the leaders involved.
Yeah, because Slobodan Milosevic is not a nationalist. He's an opportunist. And when it became clear that nationalism was no longer going to be useful to him, he dropped it. And that's when he became the peacemaker, and he's been very successful at that. He's now, the bargaining partner for the West European governments, for the American government. And the same with Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader. I mean, before this war broke out, he had kind of been a psychiatrist, and he had become involved a little bit in politics. And in fact, for a little while, he was a member of a Green Party in Bosnia. And then, there was this opportunity to get involved in the SDS, which was the Bosnian Serb political party. He took it. But he was no raving nationalist beforehand. You can talk to many people in Sarajevo who knew him very well, because he lived in Sarajevo for many years. And you never heard anything about Radovan Karadzic talking about nationalist issues or saying that the Serbs, must stand up for themselves. It was only when it became possible for him to become a political leader based on nationalism that he pursued that policy.
When I look at your book and the interviews, it seems that this was a men's war. How did the women, how did the children feel about all this?
Well, it wasn't just a man's war. I mean, of course, the frontline soldiers were, and most of the main characters were. But in fact, on the Bosnian Serb side, for example, Radovan Karadzic was the main leader. He had 2 or 3 main lieutenants. And one of them was a woman named Biljana Plavšić, who was a professor. And she actually was one of the most hard-line Bosnian Serb leaders. So, the woman's role was not totally negligible in terms of the running of the state. And there were women involved in the Croatian side and in the Bosnian side as well. But of course, it was a secondary role by and large. I think this is just, typical in most wars. And so it was not much different in this territory, except, of course, in the question of rape, of which there appears to have been quite a bit, of which, the women were victims.
Some people said that the rape was planned, that there was some kind of idea about racial mixing, forced racial interbreeding.
Well, I don't really believe that. I mean, this is all speculation because we don't even know really how much of that happened. That again is a matter of speculation. I suspect there was quite a bit. But precise numbers and anything of that sort, don't know. I don't think that there was any, plan about, trying to create Serbian children or anything like that. I mean, there were statements made to that effect by some people, but I think this is just them mouthing off and not saying something based on a plan that had been set beforehand. I mean, I think it was a method of intimidation, a method of torture, a method of cruelty, and a way to basically also for soldiers just to do the sorts of things that, unfortunately, soldiers in wartime situations, in previous conflicts, have also done.
Going back to you personally, you are now again working in Washington?
Yes.
For which newspapers?
Well, now I'm working for a number of magazines in America.
How has this personally influenced you? I mean, you wrote a book, obviously, Love Thy Neighbor, A Story of War. So you're now an author. But how do you feel about it? I mean, are you now an anti-war pacifist? How you're pretty young to go there. It must have been a tremendous influence on you.
Well, I suppose that not just for myself, but for other journalists, for other aid workers, for other outsiders who went there and spent time there, it probably had as strong of an effect on us as, for example, being a journalist or an aid worker or a soldier in Vietnam had for the foreigners who went there. So, yes, I mean, it had a strong effect on me in terms of shaping my thoughts. I mean, does it turn me into an anti-war person? Actually, in a way, the reverse. I mean, in Bosnia, there was a war going on. And once that war had started, the only way it seems like for a solution to have been arrived at was for, in a way, other people to get involved for a continuation of the war for justice.
For instance, America should have acted faster and deeper and more forceful.
Exactly. I mean, the problem in the West was one of the excuses was, well, we don't like war, so we just want to stop it right now, which is a noble kind of thought, we don't want to see more bloodshed. But the fact was that the only way that justice was going to be achieved in Bosnia, or most probably, unfortunately, will be achieved in Bosnia, is if the people who are responsible for conquering and cleansing it are forced off the land. And so for that reason, there are such things as just wars, which World War II was. And so you have to, not approach all wars from just a blanket ideological viewpoint, but take a look at, whether or not there is a good side and a bad side, and whether or not, therefore, the bad side has to be pushed back from the borders that it had crossed over.
Yeah, has seeing the misery and you were under actual fire there?
Everybody was.
Everybody was. Okay, but has that influenced your view on American politics now? You went back to a country which is so-called normal, but right. Has it changed your view on what's happening in America?
It hasn't really changed my view on what's happening in America. I mean, it's made me realize perhaps that societies aren't as stable as we like to think they are, because 10 years ago, if you had been in Sarajevo during the Winter Olympics and had suggested that there was going to be in 10 years a war there, and that
it was quite a popular holiday country.
Exactly. I mean, people would have thought you were absolutely nuts. And likewise, if you suggested now that there's going to be a war in some other place that's now peaceful, you probably would be looked at as being alarmist.
Well, we were all amazed when Los Angeles happened a few years ago.
I mean, I'm not predicting anything of that sort in America, but I'm just, in general, I just realize now that human relations are perhaps not as stable as I had thought they were beforehand, and that you must tread very carefully and avoid, kind of inciting of conflict between people, of pointing out differences and saying that not only are people different, but one person is better than another because he or she is, a particular race or ethnic background.
Okay, thank you. This was Peter Maass, who wrote a book, A Story of War. And my name is Sala, for Maass there in Amsterdam.